Okay, so last time we were about to start on false dichotomies. This time we're going to try to get through the end of the logical fallacies, Kairos, and hopefully talk some about audience-based reasoning as well. So with a false dichotomy, you've basically got two sides to an issue, and you try to pressure the reader to accept one. You might tell the reader, you're either on my side or you're on the other side, and the other side is bad. So therefore, you have to accept my side. The false dichotomy is a problem for several reasons. One is that most issues have more than two possible answers. They have more than two sides. Often we think of issues having two sides, but reality is a lot messier than that, and most issues have at least three sides, if not more. The other thing is a lot of times on issues, there's a whole spectrum of possibilities between the two sides. So a false dichotomy says you either believe something or you have no belief in it at all. It basically sets it up as two polar opposites and doesn't allow for people to say, well, I agree with parts of an argument, but not all of an argument. A burden of proof is another logical fallacy. It's similar to begging the question. If you'll remember from the last video, begging the question is assuming that an assumption you've made or a proposition that you've stated does not need evidence to back it up because you assume it's true and you assume your reader will think it's true. The burden of proof is when you're looking at an opposing argument and you can't find any evidence that the opposing side has provided. That does not mean that their viewpoint or their argument is false. It simply means that they have not provided evidence for it. The burden of proof is when there is a lack of evidence provided for the opposite side, and that does not necessarily mean it's false. If you want to say it's false, you can't just say they don't provide evidence and therefore they're wrong. You have to provide evidence that they're wrong, which can mean either finding evidence for the other side, or it can mean finding evidence which simply proves that it's wrong. Bandwagon is using peer pressure to attempt to persuade the reader. 50 million Elvis fans can be wrong. So if someone tells you that they can't be wrong, that's not a very good argument. Straw man is when you exaggerate the opposing side in order to make their arguments look weak. You take a cause and effect argument, but when you represent it as a slippery slope in order to make the other side look wrong, not because they would actually make that argument. Straw man is a logical fallacy because it's misrepresenting the other side, which is something that you don't want to do. If you misrepresent them, they won't respect you, and they're the people that you need to persuade. Red herring is bringing up a similar topic, but one which is unrelated to the writer's thesis, in order to divert the reader's attention away from the topic. So the thesis statement is about one thing. The writer goes off topic and spends 2 or 3 pages talking about something else. If the reader disagrees with the thesis, but agrees with whatever the red herring is, when they think back on the essay, they'll think that they agreed with the thesis. And therefore, they'll come to agree with whatever that thesis was, even though they would actually disagree with it. And the writer has not provided any evidence for why they should agree with it. That would be a red herring situation. So, for instance, you bring up global warming, but instead of talking about global warming, you talk about recycling. Kairos is timeliness. It's the Greek word for time. There's technically 2 words in Greek for time, Kairos and Chronos. Chronos is kind of time as a spectrum, time as a cycle. Kairos is one moment in time, particularly the opportune moment. It's about choosing the best time to make an argument. And the best time to make an argument is when it's most likely to be accepted. The best time can be chosen based on an analysis and observation of the cultural zeitgeist, which is a term which means the feelings and beliefs traveling through culture. A writer can display awareness of that by referencing current events that show the topic's relevance. So, for instance, if you're writing about something like racial segregation and racial inequality in education, you might look at something like the Michael Brown case, for instance, would be an example of that. Timelessness is also part of Kairos. In order to achieve Kairos, an author must try to make their argument timeless. The way to do that is, which basically means to be timeless, what that means is your essay will continue to have significance even after the current issue you're writing about is no longer relevant. The way you do that is you tie it to bigger issues which will continue to be relevant. So maybe let's say you're writing about virtual education, which is like a hot button topic at the moment. But in writing about virtual education, you might write about reasons that would be things like the relationship between a teacher and a student, getting students to be motivated. People are going to be talking about those issues in education long after virtual education is not a thing. Or if virtual education becomes the only thing, those things will still be relevant topics. So long after the transition to virtual education, those will continue to be issues, which makes your paper continue to be relevant. It gives people a reason to keep reading it. So that's Kairos. Ethos, pathos, logos, and Kairos come from Aristotle's Ars Rhetorica. Audience-based reasoning comes from Stephen Toulmin. Stephen Toulmin is, as I remember, believes that basically there's more than one truth. Due to moral relativism, people can't think of only finding the truth. Historically, if you were making an argument, you would be trying to find the one best answer to whatever question it is that you're trying to answer. And therefore, you would only think about one side of the issue because there'd only be one side to the issue. Whereas in audience-based reasoning, what may be true for the writer may not be true for the reader, and vice versa. So this is when audience-based reasoning comes into play. Rhetoric is all about the relationship between the writer and the reader. So to be successful, you have to think about the audience's beliefs and values. That's also part of why audience-based reasoning is useful. When you're forming your thesis, think about who might disagree with you, who might not know about your ideas but should, and who has the power to enact any solutions you're proposing. Those would all be potential audiences. It's good to write a brief profile of who you think your audience is and what they value and are interested in, and use those to help form your arguments. And kind of before we go on and look at the types of audience-based reasons, just kind of an example. Let's say you are trying to get someone to donate money to charity. Traditionally, you might think, oh, well, I'm going to tell them about all the things the charity is going to do with their money. But that's the charity's reasons for wanting them to donate. You have to think about how it would help them as a person to donate. It might make them feel better about themselves. It might be that the charity advances a cause or advances values that they have a personal interest in. It might simply be that they can write it off as a tax deduction. So think about ways in which it benefits them. What does donating to charity do for them, not what does it do for the charity? That's kind of an example of how audience-based reasoning works. You think about how it affects the person you're trying to convince, not how it affects society in general or culture in general. And especially not how it affects you yourself, which is how a lot of people, when they begin writing, think. Is they think, how does this problem affect me? And you want to think, how is it affecting my reader? There's kind of three common types of arguments of ways to formulate reasons. Reasons from category, reasons from consequence, and reasons from resemblance. Categorical arguments place the writer's topic into a category. The first step is to define that category. Second step is to provide evidence that the topic belongs in a category. And it should be a category that appeals to the audience's values. So, for instance, let's say you're arguing about school funding. You say the way schools are funded needs to be changed because schools are unequal. Well, you would have to assume that your audience thinks that schools being unequal is a problem, that that's a value that they have. They feel that schools should be equal instead of unequal. Now that you've got that category of unequal, what does it mean to be unequal? And then you would provide evidence that the schools are unequal. If you have a reason from category that's an opposing view, You can argue against it by challenging the definition of the category. It's one way to do it. The definition of the category is a warrant. It would be one of those unstated assumptions. You assume that the reader has the same idea of the category you do. So it might be useful to provide a definition of it yourself, which would be a form of backing. Or you could provide evidence that the topic does not fit into the category. You accept the definition of the category, and then you provide examples of things that are exceptions to that rule. If you have a reason from consequence, it's more of a causal argument. It's based on cause and effect. Consequential arguments are based on the effects of affecting the author's claim, whether those are consequences or benefits. What you would do is argue the likelihood of an effect. Then make it clear how that effect benefits the audience. Or if you're arguing against something, you would say that the effect would hurt the audience. To rebut an argument from consequence, what you could do is try to show that the effect is not likely to happen. Rather than trying to prove something would be an effect, try to say that something is not an effect. That would be an example of looking for a logical fallacy, such as correlation versus causation, or ad hoc or post hoc argument. Or that its effects will hurt the audience more than help it. So, whereas one side might say, oh, you should do this because it will help out a lot, you could say, yes, it would help, but there's also these other unintended consequences that could actually lead it to hurting more than it would help. Finally, a third type of reason is a reason from resemblance. These are analogies or comparisons. They use comparison contrast as a basis for how to write. They show that two situations are similar in some way, and then they explain how the similarities apply to the argument. Or conversely, they might also look at how the differences apply to the argument. This can be combined with consequence in order to show the consequences of a similar situation. We should fund schools the same way that England funds schools, because England has had good effects by funding schools this way. So you make a comparison to how someone else does something, you look at the effects of the way that they're doing it. To rebut a resemblance argument, one thing you can do is show that there's more differences than similarities. And those differences show the importance of them and why they make it so that the comparison is not possible. And argue also that the similarity has no impact on the current situation. Even though the two things are similar, the way they're similar are in inconsequential matters that don't really have much meaning. Hopefully that gives some way. Basically what you can do with those is use them as a way of brainstorming arguments, brainstorming possible reasons. They might also help you think about what the warrants are. In a categorical argument, your warrant is the definition of the category. In a argument from consequence, the warrant is that the effect will actually happen. And a reason from resemblance, the warrant is that the things are similar. Hopefully this helps you guys out as you work on developing ideas for your arguments. Thank you for your time.